Welcome to Devine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax.
Hello and welcome to Devine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax with experienced property tax attorney Nora Devine. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and I'm excited to deep dive Illinois taxes today. Nora, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, sure. Good to see you.
All right, so we're going to kind of talk about cracking the code of residential property taxes in Illinois today. So how are residential property taxes assessed in Illinois?
Well, everything in Illinois, property tax wise, should theoretically be based on the fair market value of the property. So it's supposed to be based on what you could sell the property if it were available and, for sale on the open market. So with that being said, a good starting point would be if there's a new house and you know what the builder was able to sell it for, then that may be a good indicator of what the property's worth. However, sometimes you have somebody who builds a house and they build a house for a certain amount of construction costs and land acquisition costs, and then they turn around and they are woefully unable to sell it for the amount of money that they spent building it and acquiring the land. So in that case, we say cost does not necessarily equal value, because the property tax bill is supposed to be based on what somebody would pay for it in exchange, not worth what it is worth in use by the person who decided to overbuild that property. There was a house in Lincoln Park that took about $12 million to assemble the land and demolish whatever was there. And then they spent maybe another $65 million building it. And At the end of a long effort to sell the property, it ended up selling for $13 million, $15 million, something like that. So for quite a while, you can imagine the government and the assessing officials were like, aha, this is what they paid for the land. This is what they paid in construction costs. Ergo, this is what I should assess it for. And at the end of the day, that doesn't carry, because it doesn't work like that. In Illinois, the property is worth what somebody will pay for it, not what somebody will put into it. So cost does not necessarily equal value. So you generally can, a jumping off point for assessors would be, you do consider the construction costs, but at the end of the day, you're supposed to be looking at what did the buyer pay for it when they bought it from the builder. And in certain cases, it's easy to, nothing's easy, because, there's so much upfront data collection and there's so much work that goes into assessing, because what they do is they use a mass appraisal system to take an entire subdivision or entire neighborhood. And then they examine a lot of factors, including construction costs, including recent sales, including uniformity, and they try to do a mass appraisal system for the entire subdivision or the entire neighborhood, whichever the case may be. And the problem with mass appraisal system is that, well, the beauty of it and the problem with it is that it's estimated. So it's good that it's estimated, because then it doesn't have to be perfect. And then, assessing properties is not a game of perfect. It's a game of estimated, really. Yeah. And then, and for the taxpayer, a lot of times mass appraisal can leave some inaccuracies. Property by property, you may be able to make a case of why that mass appraisal system that was used to assess your neighborhood didn't leave you in the right place in terms of your property value being assessed in a way that is commensurate with what you could sell your property for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I'm still kind of shell shocked at the 65 million to 15 million sale. Like, I know you're not in construction, but how on earth does that happen?
You see it in commercial properties too. Sometimes, if there's a franchise agreement, or if the property, is there a certain kind of trade dress required by the overarching company that is requiring the property to look a certain way or be a certain size or have certain finishes, you can pull a huge permit to change that trade dress and to make that property look a certain way. But at the end of the day, that property isn't worth that much money to anybody other than the one using the property. And in Illinois, you're supposed to be valuing it based on value in exchange, meaning what would the buyer pay for it if it were vacant and available for sale in the market, not what's it worth to the person who pulled that huge permit and put all that money into that trade dress and made that improvement to that commercial property. So in general, for residential, it's a mass appraisal system, and you're supposed to take an entire neighborhood, an entire subdivision, and you're supposed to look at the sales and look at the data, look at the construction costs, look at the condition, the age, all of the factors. And you're supposed to come up with an analysis of what the properties are worth.
Wow, that's crazy. Tell me what role local government assessments play in determining the overall property tax burden for Illinois homeowners?
The main factor driving the residential tax bills and commercial tax bills is the money that is being demanded by the schools. In Illinois, we use the property tax primarily to fund the local schools. And in Chicago, less so. Chicago benefits from getting quite a bit of funds from the state funding formula, which is derived primarily from income tax, personal income tax, and corporate income tax. But outside of Cook County, the rest of the state is, pretty much funding their entire school budget from the local property tax. And the advantage there is that the money is collected locally and it's distributed locally. And people like that. And they say they don't like it. They don't like their property taxes going up. But when anybody would propose a solution whereby they would just send more money down to Springfield and hope that it comes back in sufficient quantities to fund the school in the way that they've been used to their school being funded, nobody's interested in that experiment at all. Mm-hmm. So in other states, they do not rely this heavily on the property tax to fund the schools. And that is why Illinois has the second highest property taxes in the country. Yeah. We're second behind New Jersey, I think, the last time I looked at the reports. And that's the reason, because we fund our schools with local property tax. And it's a stubborn problem. It's structurally stubborn and difficult to change. And I don't think the voters even want to change it. I think that they like having their school funded locally.
That's interesting. It's funny because, I mentioned to you that I moved to Colorado from Chicago. And when I tell people out here what the property taxes were like in Chicago, they stare at me with like eyes as big as saucers. They can't even believe it. It's so different. I can't even describe how different it is. And so, yeah, I mean, but it makes sense.
They may have a graduated income tax, so you may pay more income tax there. Yeah. They may tax the living daylights out of their roads. Like I went to Florida and I thought, wow, these people don't have an income tax. Like, how do they fund state government? I was thinking. And then by the time I was done driving around Florida for 5 days, I had paid $300 in tolls to drive up and down like the highway. So, and in Indiana, they'll charge you $1,800 to register your luxury automobile. Whereas in Illinois, it's only $155 no matter how expensive your car was. So I think every state has their own way of getting what they need in order to fund itself, whether it's the schools or whether it's the state government. In Illinois, our specific, problem is that we overly rely on the property tax to fund the schools. And we're not taxing certain things. We're not taxing services. We're not taxing certain digital ads and digital services and digital products that we should be, perhaps even storage. And some of these, we've got major data centers going in, near O'Hare. And, how are they going to tax that? How are they going to access? So we have a changing economy. You can't keep taxing the living daylights out of real estate. They have to diversify what they're taxing. In Illinois, we don't tax retirement income. And services is a big one. I mean, there's a lot of states that tax services. If you get your dog groomed, you pay a service tax. You get your nails done, there's a service tax. You get your house cleaned, there's a service tax. But in Illinois, no. So it's really just too much coming from the property tax. And it's at a breaking point. It's really, really affecting people's ability to meet their family and financial goals.
Yeah. You brought up a good point though about it. So they'll always find a way to get it somewhere. When I first came out here to Colorado, it was quite the shock when I had to register my car. It's quite a bit more expensive here than like by hundreds and hundreds of dollars more expensive than it was.
And then they have like massive sources of tax revenue that you don't realize, like, all the ski resorts. I mean, they may be funding your whole state for all you know, like in Alaska, perhaps the way they're drilling in for natural resources and things like that, they may be, funding the whole government, and therefore they can afford to not have an income tax and afford to have low property taxes.
Right.
So every state has their own way of getting what they need. Mm-hmm. And educating their own citizens. And in Illinois, we are definitely pulling the money out of the property tax, probably overly so.
Yeah, very interesting. So tell me a little bit about the impact of the PTELL, or the Property Tax Extension Limitation Law, on residential property taxes.
Yeah, it's a pretty effective tool. It was put into place by the legislature decades ago, and it basically says that whatever you levied last year, you can levy about 105% over whatever you levied last year. So if you asked the property tax for $100 last year, the property tax extension limitation law would limit you from asking for more than $105 from the property tax this year.
Okay.
And there's some detailed exceptions for new property. For example, if a new subdivision comes online, it's not reasonable to expect the school district to do to get by with the same amount of money that it did last year if they're taking on now however many new students, you see.
Right.
So if there's new property coming online, they make allowances for that, and they allow them to levy over what they levied the year before. So importantly, if a community uses home rule, they're not subject to the property tax extension limitation law. Oak Park comes to mind, that they can kind of levy whatever they want, and there's no need for a referendum. But most of the assessed value in the state of Illinois, like if you looked at the map of the counties that are subject to PTELL, you'd be like, oh, a lot of the state's not subject to PTELL. But if you look at how much of the property value is subject to PTELL, it's substantial. It's a lot. So it is a law that is supposed to hold the property tax down and keep it from, expanding too rapidly. And if you want to get more money from the property tax compared to what you got last year from the property tax, you have to go to the voters and you have to ask for a referendum unless you're home rule.
Okay. So what are the main exemptions then that are available for residential property owners in Illinois?
The big one is the homeowners exemption. So if you own the home and you live in the home, then you can get a part of your assessed value exempted, which means that if your exemption, if your whole property assessed value was this big, maybe it would exempt like this part of it. So your whole assessment, and they would exempt this, and then you'd pay tax on the rest, is kind of the way I like to explain it. And
that's if you live in the house that you own rather than like renting it or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the exemption has been expanded in Cook County. It's larger in Cook County than it is outside of Cook County. But there's talk to expand that to the rest of the state. So if I'm teaching a class or something about property tax, sometimes people criticize me for talking too much about Cook County because they're not from Cook County. They think that they don't have to know about how the property tax is administered in Cook County. But I always like to tell them, you should pay attention, because historically, whatever is rolled out in Cook County is coming soon to a jurisdiction near you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
yeah, for sure. It usually starts in the cities, right?
So yeah, there's a homeowner's exemption, which is basically I own it, I live in it, I get a little piece like exempted. And it's not a meaningful amount in like, let's say in the city of Chicago, maybe it's $700, which is, it's a lot, but it's not, but if you live in a place that has an enormous tax burden, like Harvey, Illinois, they may have a 27% tax rate instead of 7%, like for the city of Chicago, maybe 7%, city of Harvey, maybe 27, 28%. Other places are even higher. So now you're talking real money. These can be very valuable. And then there's ways to have the homeowner's exemption in place. If it's a single family home and it's occupied by a tenant that's responsible for tax, you can get the assessing officials to apply the homeowner's exemption to the property, believe it or not. So a lot of these properties are being bought by investors, and then they put a tenant in there, make them responsible for tax, turn the lease into the assessing officials, get the exempt. So when you add up the exemptions, whether it's the homeowner exemption plus the senior exemption, plus if it's a low income senior, then they also get the senior freeze. You had a lot of properties just fall off the tax roll in some of these communities because the tax rate was so high. And when you add those exemptions together, it exempted the entire assessment, not just this part. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so then the tax rate has to escalate in order to accommodate the fact that the assessed value was lost. So it's a zero-sum game. The school district is always going to get what they asked for, but the tax rate is just going to keep adjusting sky high in order to make the math work, so that the taxes do get collected and given over to the district.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's
so that's
you're
an
right.
episode.
You're right. That is a problem
in terms of like how, and I've read some scholarly articles about how expanding these homeowners exemptions is the exact wrong thing to do if you're trying to bring property tax relief to some of these communities that have a runaway tax rate.
Sort of a short-sighted approach.
Yeah, and the senior freeze in Cook County is now a minimum tax dollar value of $2,000. So you had even people just telling the treasurer, well, I mean, my tax bill is $0, but you owe me $820 because the way the statute reads is that it's a minimum tax dollar value of $2,000. So I don't think that logic has gone anywhere yet, but you had an enormous number of houses come off the tax roll when those exemptions were expanded.
Let me ask you this. Let's say I'm a homeowner in Cook County and I receive a property tax bill and I believe it's too high. It's way too high. Like, what is the process? What should I do?
If you're holding a bill in your hand, it's too late.
Okay. Damn it.
Okay. And that's not true in other states. In
Okay.
Indiana, when you receive the bill, that's your notification that it's time for you to complain about your assessment. But that's not how it works in Illinois. When you're holding the bill in Illinois, it is too late to do anything about that bill, like 99.9% of the time. So,
what if I get an assessment before the bill?
You need to get excited when you see the actual reassessment notice. Like that's when it's time to worry about what is going to be happening. And a lot of people don't realize that. And so a lot of people don't call me until they have the bill. And then it's a tough situation because there's very, very little, almost nothing that could be done.
Wow. Okay. So, well, then let me back up. When I get the assessment before the bill comes and I want to fight it and I don't like what I'm seeing, how does that process unfold? What should I do? I
recommend that you just hire an attorney to monitor your assessment for you, because if the mail doesn't come, if your dog eats your assessment notice, if you never see it, if you don't understand it, because it is confusing. They don't talk in terms of property value; they talk in terms of assessed value. Well, in Cook County, your assessed value is 10% of your fair market value, and taxpayers open that in the mail and they go, "What does this mean?" And over the years, I think the assessing administrations have tried to get better about explaining what the notice means, but you still get a lot of confusion. Way back when, back in the early 1900s, the assessed value was the same as the property value. But as time went on, the assessed values were separating. So the market value was up here and the assessed value kind of kept, getting further away from and then so what they would do is they would then change the law and they would say, well, actually now properties are now assessed at 50% of fair market value. Mm-hmm. So they changed the law to comport with the assessments rather than changing the assessments to comport with the law. And we saw that in 2009, the Cook County assessor at the time went to the county board in Cook County and asked for a Cook County classification ordinance change. And they called it the 1025 ordinance because prior to passing that ordinance, the commercial property mostly was assessed at 38%, and the residential property was supposed to be assessed at 16%. Well, study after study after study revealed that those ratios weren't being adhered to at all. So instead of making the assessments comport with the ordinance, they then changed the ordinance to comport with the actual level of assessment that was the de facto situation. Mm-hmm. So it went down to 25% for commercial and 10% for residential. And that's where we are now.
Is there a difference if a homeowner receives a bill and they look at it and they think there's an error on it? Not just that like they don't like the number, but they feel like it's an error. Do they have more options at that point?
Yes. If you get the assessment notice and there is an error on it, you can go to the assessor yourself and ask them to correct the error. And if they don't, then you can file at the board of review on your own behalf or through counsel. And and if they don't do anything about it, then, if it's a property characteristic issue, those things really need to be resolved at the assessor, because theoretically the assessor is the one with the field department. Right. And the assessor is the one that can actually go out there and remeasure the building and reconfirm the characteristics. And the board of review doesn't have resources like that in Cook County, and they don't in other counties either. So if it's a characteristic issue, you definitely want to get in with the assessor during, the opening for the filing deadline and get ahead of it. If it's a valuation issue, we find that the assessor doesn't frequently reevaluate his valuations. Mm-hmm. They kind of set the value and they're like, well, and they stand by their view of what the property's worth. So those appeals are not as successful usually at the assessor level.
Is it the same thing though, where if you've gotten the bill, is it too late to say anything if there's an error, or is that different than just these?
Well, if there's an error and you have the bill in your hand, then you can go back. If there's an exemption that's missing, that's easy to fix. That right. You can go back 3 years on that. That's really simple to do. You don't need an attorney for that. If you live in suburban Cook County, you have a local township assessor who could be a extremely amazing advocate for you. You just go in the office and you say, I got this bill. My exemptions aren't on here. They bend over backwards and they help the taxpayers so much. If you live in Chicago, you don't have a local township assessor. You have to go down to 118 North Clark to the third floor where the assessor's office is, and you try to talk it over with somebody at the exemption desk there. But you don't need an attorney for the exemption mistakes. If you have a property characteristic issue, you could try to fix that on your own retroactively through a process called certificate of error. The problem with certificate of error is the legal posture is that it's the assessor on their own volition, kind of looking back over their shoulder and saying, maybe I got that wrong. And then they're correcting it on their own. So if they say, no, I'm not issuing this certificate of error, there's nowhere to go after that. You can't appeal it to anywhere, not to the Board of Review, not to court, not to PTEB. You kind of have one bite at the apple. So if the stakes are high, I do recommend running it by an attorney before you try to help yourself with those.
Yeah. If it's that slim of a chance, you gotta get everything you can in your corner. Makes sense to me. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to Devine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax with experienced property tax attorney Nora Devine. For more information or to connect with Nora, you can visit thedevinelawgroup.com. And of course, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments. Nora, always great to see you. Thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.